Hi, I'm Jason Nelson, Dr. Jason Nelson. I'm a digital poet, creator of all sorts of literary digital creatures. I make interactive fictions. I'm also a professor here at the Queensland College of Art at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. And you might notice by my accent, I didn't grow up in Australia, I grew up in Oklahoma. My grandparents are farmers, grew up on the plains, and somehow ended up in Australia teaching interactive writing, which I must admit I love. Before I start talking about my work, I have to thank the organizers of the event, of this conference, and the workshops. They've been great. Really, honestly, I've been incredibly impressed, and I'm apologetic that I cannot be there. I had looked forward to this trip. I had looked forward to being there. Unfortunately, some of the rumors about Australia are true. There are some dangerous spiders here. There are a lot of creatures that, suffice it to say, if you're not careful, can make you very sick. And I've learned that lesson. In fact, I'm learning it now as I'm saying this. So unfortunately, the doctor recommended I don't travel. And so that's why I'm speaking to you via video. But, I don't always do this, and that's a real sign for how I think important this conference is. The fact that I'm wanting to produce a video to really share my work with your audience, and hopefully, since it's a video form, you can share it with other people as well. All right, so I just want to take you through some of my work. You have to forgive me, by the way, right now. I'm actually lying in bed doing this. I've been having to rest quite a bit. So I'll have a drink of tea here, and I'll take you through some of my works. Now, as you can see on this webpage, there is just a very small sampling of some of my works. I mean, my digital writing uses things like game engines, recombinatory code, algorithms, all sorts of interactive techniques. Increasingly, it uses physical technology, large touch screens, pretty much anything. I mean, according to me, according to how I think about interactive writing, I think anything can be something that can be used to make interactive writing. I mean, any technology. Now, of course, you might say, well, what about a vacuum cleaner? Well, I made an artwork out of a vacuum cleaner a couple years ago. It's called the Poetry Robot. And literally, what it is, it's a Roomba robot with, and Roomba is a brand name. It's like one of those robotic vacuum cleaners that roams around a space. And it had screens on top of it. In fact, let's see if I can find it. Ah, good. Here's actually a test of it, which I find quite interesting. Wait for that to load. But basically, the idea of this project was to see if I could take an autonomous robot, i.e. a robotic vacuum cleaner, and put screens on top of it, as you can see here, and then allow it to roam through a gallery space. And it was interesting. I mean, like a lot of these things, it's an experiment. This is a Roomba base that we've removed the vacuum cleaner at the bottom. Can you see that? That gets it going, and then the damn thing's going to start. So you can see here, this is my little poetry robot. It's a first version. It's still being under development. But I quite liked it. It kind of roamed through a gallery space, and the text would change as it explored the space. And I think there's a lot of possibilities for this kind of work. And so that's just a short example of how you can use anything, I think, for interactive writing. All right, let me take you through some of my earlier works. I usually start with public talks. I usually start with this work called Sydney, Siberia. I start with this work because I think it's a fascinating way of organizing an interface for a digital poem. So basically what happened is I was doing an artist residency in a place called Newcastle here in Australia. And Newcastle is kind of this old industrial town. The economy's not doing so well and a lot of people have left. And so the place has a lot of really interesting kind of rundown places, abandoned buildings. I found it quite fascinating. So I walked around this city, took hundreds of photographs, and then on the photographs I drew on top of them and wrote text. But I wanted to think of a way I could create some type of interface that allowed people to explore these little poetry tiles. I'm calling them poetry tiles. And would allow for this sort of infinite recombinatory look and feel of the work. So let me show it to you. So you go into it, and as you notice, every time you click, it focuses in, then it starts processing again. And here's the wow moment. It continuously does this. It doesn't cease. Like each new level, it creates new mosaics. And so I've checked server stats. Sometimes people will read this thing for hours, just exploring for new tiles, exploring for new poetic meaning. And it's kind of this really powerful, really kind of beautiful way, I think, of interacting with work. And so each time you get to a level like this is like a poetic stanza with all these tiles. And then you go to another section, and you're continuously exploring. And one of the things that's been nice about this particular work is that people have liked this so much that they've wanted me to redo it in lots of different ways. Indeed, when there was a tsunami that hit Japan in about, 4 or 5 years ago in northern Japan, the Japanese government came to me, and they had seen this work, Sydney, Siberia. They quite liked it. And there was a city that had been greatly impacted by the tsunami there in Japan. And they asked me if I would work with a group of kids who were living there to see possibly if I could make a similar work with them. So we gave them cameras, and we had them go around their town, taking pictures of whatever they could, and then writing poetic text in Japanese. And the end result, again, was really powerful. Again, you can see it's a little bit different interface, but it's a similar idea. You're continuously exploring, continuously zooming, and then these are all images that these kids took. You know, it's their way of trying to deal with what was quite a dramatic and quite painful event for them. And so I'm quite proud of the fact that, you know, you can use digital poetry as a way of engaging with really powerful and sometimes quite tragic events. So some of my work engages with interactive interfaces such as this. And so I've done a few of these types of works using this kind of interface. But I'm also known for my work that uses game engines. Now, to me, video games are a really, really important, how should I put this? Video games have a language unto themselves. I mean, whether you play video games or not, you can't deny the power that video games have had over society over the past 20, 30 years. And so video games have created their own, not only world, but their own grammar. So if you think of poetry and literature as having a grammar, an organization, stories and narratives have a certain structure, games do a very similar thing. So it seemed logical to me to combine a game engine with poetry. So this particular work, what it does is it's kind of exploring this notion that people need forever praise. Like basically, anymore these days, people want, like imagine students, maybe some of your students, they need constant praise, right?
YouTube, you.
So this game is exploring that poetic notion, but it's using this idea of a game engine. So you have to explore the game environment
This is the culmination of
in order to experience the work. So literally, the reading process is playing a game. And you can see it's not a challenging game, intentionally so. In fact, it's quite a slow game, but that's because I wanted people to stop, to think about the writing. Now you can see a lot of my works think about combining language, but digital poetry is not just about words, obviously. You have all these elements. You can see you have animations, you have images, you have movement, you have interactivity, you have sounds, you have video, you obviously have words, you have code, sometimes you have databases and algorithms. All those things become literary elements. All those things are part of the writing process of making an interactive digital poem. Now that's a hard thing for some people to get, because you have to kind of rethink yourself and you say, okay, well, I'm writing with all this stuff. I'm no longer just writing with words. I'm writing with interfaces and game engines. I'm having to think about how text interacts with image and sound. And so can be quite complex, can be quite difficult to write sometimes. So I've made a lot of works with game engines. In fact, my most well-known work in that genre is a work called Game, 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 and Again Game. Now I'm going to tell you guys a secret. I don't normally tell people this. Oops, the URL's wrong. There we go. I don't normally tell people this, but this work, to be honest with you, when I first made it, I wasn't sure what I was doing. This was a time at which people really weren't exploring and playing with game engines. And so as a writer, digital poet, digital artist, how could I possibly use a game engine, something like Mario Brothers, for example, to make an interactive poem? And so I found some different sort of templates, and I played around with code, and I created a basic platform game engine, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try to make something. And so I made this, and this thing took off in the world. It has had probably 10 million people play it. I still get emails about it, even though it was about 9 years ago when I made it. It was featured all around the world. And it was kind of this amazing thing that spread. And I'm not even sure how. I think it's because it was so different. It was so unlike anything else that it became this kind of cultural entity. And of course, it's also quite insane. It is admittedly a very weird work.
Come on and meet your maker.
In many ways, the work I wanted to be messy. I wanted it to be very hand-drawn. I wanted things to be marked out and messed up. Part of that is because, for me, I don't like clean design. I don't like works that have a really polished look to them. Because if you look around and you see your friends and your colleagues here, none of us are polished. I'm sick right now giving this talk. I'm sweating a bit because I've got a bit of a fever. And so, I'm not polished, neither are you, and I think our work should reflect that. And so, this work, for example, explores all different types of belief systems. So the first one is kind of this idea of just falling into the sun. This is about what might be called faith. This level is about real estate, and how many places in Australia, at least, real estate is a type of belief system, which is kind of a really interesting process. Oh, one other thing that a lot of people don't know about, inside of my works, I always hide things. I love to hide stuff. Previously, I think people used to call them Easter eggs, especially on old DVDs and stuff. And so if you notice here in the right-hand corner, there's a video. And a lot of my works contain things that my grandfather used to make. He shot old videos on 8mm cameras. And a lot of times I actually use his old content and his old videos in my work. And that's kind of a personal thing for me. I love to put things from people that I know and I care about into my work. I've done other things, like for example, I kind of like this work. This is called the Poetry Cube. It's pretty old. One thing I love about it is it invited participation. Excuse me, it invited participation. So what that means basically is that I wanted people to use this interface as a way of writing. So you can actually go in, you can write a poem, and then once you save it, it'll put it into, it'll put it into this interface. So for example, I can rotate it. But then I can also go in, and I can come out. And if I rotate this upwards, and then I go back in, the poem starts to change. And then if I rotate upwards again from that point, and I go back out, again, the poem is very different. What this makes for is a very recombinatory experience. It's an interactive cube almost, but even more complex than that. Because every time you spin it, every time you turn it, it's recreating the meaning of the poem. And there are, hundreds of people that have done things with these poems. In fact, this is just the first few here on the front, but there are thousands of them. And I love that. I love the fact that people have all explored this. I mean, you can see here at the bottom, I think it ended up being a couple hundred. And so you can see here, someone has entered Cat in a Hat, which I kind of love. And you can invert it, which basically just means, this is the way it would look if you wanted to sort of concentrate just on the text. So sometimes my work is made with game engines. Sometimes my work is trying to engage with people. It's trying to get them to contribute some of the content. And I think that's also important. I mean, I'm good at this, I guess you could say. I love making it. And that can be a powerful thing. But I also want to invite people to make their own work. In fact, the workshops recently, I created some of the first materials I've done in a long while to create your own digital poetry, to really encourage people to start exploring this kind of work. I'll show you this work. Now, this is a relatively new work. I did this about a year ago or so. This came from a grant of about $100,000, which is a lot of money to an artist like myself, a whole lot of money. And the idea was that these people, this is at the Queensland University of Technology, they had this space. Now, this is the world's, at least it was at the time, the world's largest touchscreen space. This is a series of giant touchscreens. And they wanted me to create interactive writing and interactive poetry for this giant space. Now, normally, my work is designed for laptops. Or, occasionally, I'm not sure what it is, but occasionally I design for phones, for example. But this work was designed specifically for a giant touchscreen space. Now, that was very difficult to do. It was difficult because I had to completely reimagine my work. It no longer was for this small space. Instead, it was for a giant cube space. And I think my work ended up being so successful partially because it really did get people exploring. It really did get people wanting to engage with this space and wanting to create their own poetic text. But it was very difficult to make just because of the complexity of it. For example, each of these touchscreens here has a server. So you have to network this work over multiple computers. And that could be very, very difficult. I'll show you this video. Now, I think I really like this video to some extent because of the fact that this is kind of showcasing me playing with it. So you can see there's some kids playing with it. One thing I do like too is my work. Some of my works are taught in grammar schools, you know. Young kids seem to like it. Now, some of my works, of course, have pretty strong adult content, so that wouldn't be good for them. But I think interactive works automatically attract younger people because they want to play with it. They want to experience it. So I think this is kind of a magical moment where you can swipe on these giant touchscreens and all these things appear. I think it's quite amazing. And, you know, because this was for a university, I had to combine things like chemistry with it. So this is obviously not purely text. It's a combination of art, of visuals, and also words. You'll notice in some other levels. And I bring that up because, you know, sometimes in the digital writing field, it crosses over to lots of genres. You know, indeed, there used to be a joke, and I'll tell you this joke briefly. The joke is, people often ask me, what do I call myself? Am I a digital artist? Am I a digital poet? Am I a net artist? Am I a robotics artist? You know, am I a video artist? Am I an interactive artist? What am I? And my answer sometimes is, I am whatever the grant calls for. You academics might get that. Like whatever the grant is asking for, whatever the gallery is asking for, well, that's what I am. Basically what that means is, I don't know what to call myself sometimes. I mean, when you make work that crosses over into multiple fields, what do you call yourself? I'm an artist, I'm a creator. Basically, I create works with a poetic intent, with a poetic heart to them. And that's my main interest. So I made this work. I also made a giant, so I made an interactive poem, but I also made a, it's a giant puzzle game that reveals a fiction. There's a mystery. Now, I don't have time to go through the whole mystery here, but I will play you the video. Basically, what people have to do is they have to solve these giant cryptexts. And the crypttext is basically like a puzzle. Like you would have a whole bunch of wheels. And if you align the wheels just right, it reveals things about what happens above. And so this giant crypttext basically then revealed all these different narratives at the top. And I think it made sense to me because of the fact that these screens all kind of reminded me of that configuration of basically a bunch of giant wheels, and you have mysteries you have to solve. And I kind of love that. Again, this took me 6 months to create. Sometimes I think that when people get into this field, they underestimate actually how long it takes to create this kind of work. It takes a very, very long time, long time in some cases. Because you're having to work with new technology and you're having to explore these kinds of things. This is a work I've done recently that I think, you know, I'll give you another little insight. One of the difficulties of making interactive work, and this is quite a big difficulty, I think, is the fact that when technology changes, as an artist and creator, you have to change your work. And sometimes you have to change your work rather dramatically. And so this is a work called Nervous System. And it uses HTML, HTML5, JavaScript. And basically the idea is you go in and out of this interface. So you can move into it and you can move out of it. Previously, I used Flash. In fact, most of my old works were done in Flash. Now, that's a difficult process a lot of people in our field went through. Because the fact that when Flash died, and yes, Steve Jobs from Apple, he killed Flash. When he killed Flash, that pretty much meant that a lot of people in my field stopped creating because one of their main tools was no longer viable. And so that's something you also have to do as a digital writer or a digital artist or a digital academic, really anybody working with technology. You always have to rethink yourself. You have to reimagine your work for new technologies. And that took me about a year to completely rethink my practice, to move away from one technology and move into another. And that can be a really difficult process to go through. It's kind of like, I think one of the best examples I can think of is imagine, I kind of love this, by the way. This is a mouse follower work that draws and writes things on the screen. It's kind of beautiful. But imagine you're a painter and someone comes to you and says, you know those brushes you've been using and all this paint? You can't use that anymore. You now have to use spoons and food dye. Or you're a sculptor. You know the clay you've been working with? You can't use clay anymore. Now you have to use concrete and grass. Okay, well that's a bit extreme, but you get my idea. You have to use new tools. And that can be very, very difficult for people. Indeed, it was difficult for me to sort of rethink myself for new technologies and new tools. Oh, I have to show you this one section. This is a work called The Required Field. I personally have a great distaste for bureaucracy. I don't know there where you're living if the government and the bureaucracy is a very powerful thing, if it's something that's frustrating you all the time. But for me, bureaucracies frustrate me. So I wanted to make this work called The Required Field that explores that. So one of the things I love is this particular work here. What it does is it allows you to go in and search. And if you search, all these little fields start to grow and change. So for example, if I type in door. So notice as I type in each letter, it narrows it down. And that happens live. And so I really quite love this. I love this notion of a work that is like a series of little molecules, like a series of little particles kind of roaming around the space. And it really completely changes the way you think about poetry, but also the way you navigate it. And so I type in the word belly, and you get a small thing. And bell, E, and BE comes up with something. And so basically, it's doing it live, searching through these giant fields of text to create these really interesting interactive experiences. And that, to me, is a really powerful and interesting way of exploring digital poetry. Before I show you more work, I just want to also show you something else. If I minimize some of these windows here, so let's just go to this desktop. And let me just go into one of these. Which folder should I go into? Possible poems, let's say. These, for example, these are all works that I've been exploring. They're not done. I'm playing around with things. And I have tons of folders like this of experiments, of things that are possibly going to become an interactive poem. I start them, I play around with them, and oftentimes they don't work out. Well, I'm telling you this because of the fact that this field also requires a great deal of experimentation. You have to experiment constantly. And that means that, admittedly, you have to be willing to accept failure. I don't mean failure in your career. I don't mean failure in terms of who you are or your work in general. I just mean you start with an experiment, you see if it works, and it doesn't. So you try something else. And I think that's a really important process for people in this field, to be willing to explore and try things, and when it doesn't work, fine. You move on. And you go and you try something else. And that, I think, is really central to people that create the kind of things that I create, is this notion of experimentation. I think is really, really critical. I've got this one little bit here. Oh, by the way, I have to show you this. I've just won a major award, which is quite exciting. They have one of Australia's biggest awards is the Queensland Literary Awards. And you guys will be one of the first people to hear this. I've recently won the digital writing category of the Queensland Literary Awards. So you can see here, Queensland, the QT Digital Literature Award. It says this much. You never get that much. They just say it, which is unfortunate. But anyway. And I won it for a work called 9 Billion Branches. In fact, I'll show it to you now. 9 Billion Branches is this work I made over the last 4 or 5 months. It was released in April, more or less. And it's a work kind of about how narratives are everywhere. Everywhere we go, everywhere we explore. If you walk to the store, if you go to a park, if you go to your friend's house, you go see a movie, wherever you go, there are stories. We're constantly surrounded by stories, constantly surrounded by narratives. And so the idea behind this work is I wanted to explore that. I wanted to sort of show how we're constantly experiencing narratives. And you can see that this work is filled with all sorts of things that I quite love. And these are bits of poetic text, bits of poetic elements. A lot of them are exploring weird places, strange locations. But it's this notion that everywhere you go, we're going to experience poetic text. And so to me, that's a really powerful thing. The fact that we're surrounded by narratives. We're surrounded by experiences and poetics. And I think that once you start looking for that, then the connection between these tiny little narratives that we're constantly experiencing and technology can become really powerful. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. Now, this is a work called The Baphomet Fires. I'm showing you this one because this is a work that's great and also not so great. I wanted to make basically a board game, you know, like a game you might play without technology. But I wanted to do it in a digital format. So basically, this whole story is told through this game. And indeed, the story is actually told through questions. So I roll the dice, and then you get these questions come up. The questions don't necessarily make sense. The questions themselves are quite strange. But it's the answering of the questions that reveals parts of the story.
Your answer moves you forward.
And so you get the right answer, you get to go forward, but it doesn't necessarily matter if you get the answer right or not. Yeah, you can win the game. However, that's not the point. The point is that you're trying to figure out how do you tell a story through a board game and also through the process of asking questions. And that's a very strange and interesting way of creating a work. Indeed, I'll read this question. 2 were married, 1 was lost to the cough and fever, and infections and life force emptying power of the fears. How did the one who remained avoid being stricken by the fears? And first question is, through disguises and cunning detours, they deftly hide from the fears. 2, they cooked up a plan with the fears to sacrifice others in order to save themselves. And 3, like small doses of viruses and vaccines, they became immune by briefly embracing a moment of the fears each day. So, for example, the notion of fears.
Your decisions.
I got it wrong, I guess. These fears are a central notion to this narrative. And so a lot of the questions inside of this game have to do with this notion of the fears. So again, I have game engines, I've got giant interactive touchscreens, I've got small robots, I've been using lots of different types of software, I deal with recombinatory issues. I pride myself, I guess, what I think is most powerful about my work, at least I hope, is the fact that I'm constantly experimenting. Oh, by the way, just in case you want to see, this is me, and I was going to show you about. This is my office. We live out in the country. I say we, it's my wife and I. And we live in a beautiful area of Australia. So literally this picture here you see, that is me, horses behind me, with a little desk in front. And that's kind of where my world exists. I'm a digital artist who loves living in the country. Indeed, I imagine a lot of digital artists, a lot of digital poets, are people who are constantly in contradiction. You know, we are people who love to create, but also people who want to live in the woods. You know, usually people with technology want to live in big cities, but no, I don't. I want to live out in the country. And I do that, I think, well, I mean, of course you have spiders, which can bite you and make you sick, which is terrible. But I think I do that because of the fact that I love creating, but I also love just being outside. And so if you can combine the two, it can be a really, really powerful and a really wondrous experience. All right, so I guess this is how I'd like to end this talk, is simply by saying I would encourage all of you to not only explore my work, which I would love it, and in fact, you're more than welcome to email me and ask me questions. I'd be happy to talk to you. In fact, here, I'll write a little note on the screen. Here we go. I already had it. So this is me. There's my email address. So if you want to, please send me an email, ask me questions, and I would love to respond. And there's my website, one of them, got many websites, Secret Technology. So secret and then technology.com. But I would also encourage you, aside from just playing around with my work, I would encourage you actually to go explore other works. So the best places to go for that, one is the ELMCIP directory. So if you just type in ELMCIP, and the very first link will be this. Now this was made, I recently had a Fulbright fellowship and I was spending a year in Norway. My wife and I did that. And when we were there, we worked with the people that developed this, and this is an amazing collection of work from around the world. So if you go to See All Creative Works, and we go down here at the bottom, there are probably 600 works listed in here. 600. And I think it's incredible. There's a massive amount of work that exists inside this database. And so I would strongly encourage you guys to go and explore, for example, ELMCIP. Another place you can go to is eliterature.org. That is the home of the Electronic Literature Organization, which I'm on the board of. Very proud of that. And Electronic Literature Organization has all sorts of things, but one of the things they have is a collection, and there's 3 of them, and that's a great place to start seeing all sorts of electronic literature works. So I'm happy to have a couple works in here, Game, and Again Game, which I showed you, also another work called This Is How You Will Die, but a whole range of works featured inside of this. And so I would strongly encourage you guys to go to volume 1, 2, and 3 and see what you can find. To just explore other people's work, because it's a magical, giant field. Well, okay, not a giant field, not yet, but it's growing. And no, digital writing, digital poetry is not going to replace print. We'll still have print, because some days electricity goes out, and I want to have a book there. But it is a different form, and it's a form that will grow. And believe me, your kids or your kids' kids will expect interactive work. And when they do, you want to have them reading something, reading poetry, reading literature. And so if you can make that work interactive, all the better, as far as I'm concerned, especially if you can get them reading poetry. Can you imagine you're getting your students and your kids engaging with and loving poetry, but they're doing it in a game engine? That to me is a very powerful thing. All right, I'm not feeling well, so this has got to be the end of my talk, but I thank you for your time. And again, the organizers have been massively good, and I really have to applaud them for all the work they've done. And I'm honored to be able to speak to you, and I'm very sorry that I can't be there. But like I said, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Drop me an email here. This is my personal email address. Or go to my website and explore my work, and there's a contact form there. Any questions at all, I'll be happy to answer them. Again, thank you very much. Enjoy the conference. And I honestly do hope to hear from some of you soon. All right. Cheers. Thanks. I got to go to sleep. Bye-bye.